Richard Sterling roared with laughter when the 2-year-old girl declared, "I speak 9 languages perfectly." Lily, the cleaning lady's daughter, stared at him with unwavering determination. What came next from her lips froze the laughter on his face forever. Richard Sterling adjusted his $80,000 Patek Philippe watch, surveying with absolute disdain the boardroom on the 52nd floor of his corporate tower in the heart of Toronto. At 51, he had built a technology empire that had made him the richest man in Canada, with a personal fortune of $1.2 billion, but also the most ruthless and arrogant in the country. His office was an obscene monument to his excessive ego. Walls of black Carrara marble, artwork costing more than entire mansions, and a 360-degree panoramic view that constantly reminded him he was literally above all the mortals crawling through the streets like insignificant ants. But what Richard enjoyed most wasn't his astronomical wealth, but the sadistic power it gave him to humiliate and destroy those he considered inferior. "Mr. Sterling," his secretary's trembling voice interrupted his thoughts of superiority through the golden intercom. "Miss Davis and her daughter have arrived for the cleaning. Shall I send them in?" He replied with a cruel smile that slowly spread across his tanned face. "Today I'm going to have a little fun." Over the past week, Richard had been meticulously planning his favorite game of public humiliation. He had received, as part of a family inheritance, an ancient document written in multiple languages that the city's best translators had declared impossible to fully decipher. It was a mysterious text with characters that blended Mandarin, Arabic, Sanskrit, and other languages that even university experts couldn't identify. But Richard had turned this into his most sadistic personal entertainment. At that moment, the glass door silently opened. Clara Davis, 45, entered in her impeccable navy blue uniform, pushing her faithful cleaning cart, which had been her constant companion for the past 8 years working in this building. Behind her, with hesitant steps and a worn but clean school backpack, came her daughter, Lily. Lily Davis, 12, was the perfect antithesis of the obscene world of luxury surrounding her. Her black shoes, though carefully shined, had seen better days. Her public school uniform was mended but spotless, and her books from the Evergreen Public Library protruded from a backpack that had clearly passed through several older siblings. Her eyes, large and curious, contrasted dramatically with the submissive and fearful gaze her mother had developed after years of being treated as invisible. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," Clara mumbled, her head bowed. Exactly as she had learned he expected. "I didn't know you had a meeting. My daughter is with me today because I have no one to leave her with. We can come back later if you prefer." No. Richard stopped her with a laugh that sounded like the bark of a predator. "Stay. This is going to be absolutely hilarious." He stood behind his black marble desk, his eyes gleaming with the cruelty of someone who had found new prey to torment. He walked around them like a circling shark, relishing the obvious terror in Clara's eyes and the confusion in little Lily's. "Clara, tell your daughter what Mom does here every day," Richard ordered with a poisonous smile. "Lily already knows, sir. I clean the offices," Clara replied softly, her hands gripping the handle of her cart until her knuckles turned white. "Exactly. You clean." Richard clapped sarcastically, his voice laden with contempt. "And tell her, what's your level of education, Clara?" Clara felt the heat of humiliation rise to her cheeks. "Sir, I finished high school." "High school? Barely high school." Richard exploded in a cruel laugh that echoed throughout the office. "And here's your little daughter, who probably inherited the same mediocre genes." Lily felt something strange stirring within her chest. For years, she had seen other children in her class live in big houses, have new clothes, and their parents pick them up in luxury cars. She had accepted that her family was different, that they had less, but she had never seen anyone humiliate her mother so directly and cruelly. In fact, Richard had an idea that he found absolutely hilarious. "Lily, come closer. I want to show you something." Lily looked at her mother, who nodded nervously, and approached the desk with small but determined steps. Despite her youth, there was something in her eyes that Richard had never seen in Clara's, a spark of defiance that had not been completely crushed by poverty and circumstances. "Look at this document." Richard placed the ancient papers before her eyes as if they were a dirty rag. "The 5 smartest translators in the city can't read this. They are university doctors, professors with international degrees, language experts who have studied for decades." Lily looked at the papers with genuine curiosity. Her eyes moved over the strange characters, the words in languages that seemed to dance between different writing systems. "Do you know what this means?" Richard asked with a mocking smile that spread across his face. It was a rhetorical question, a cruel joke designed to demonstrate the obvious inferiority of this poor child compared to educated academics. To his surprise, Lily did not look away immediately. Instead, she studied the document with an intensity that was disconcerting in someone so young. "No, sir," she finally replied softly. "Of course not." Richard roared with laughter, slapping the desk with both hands. A 1-2-year-old girl from a cleaning family, while doctors with 30 years of experience can't either. He turned to Clara, his voice becoming even more venomous. "Do you realize the irony, Clara? You clean the bathrooms of men who are infinitely smarter than you, and your daughter will end up doing exactly the same because intelligence is inherited." Clara gritted her teeth, trying to hold back the tears of humiliation that threatened to spill. For 8 years, she had endured comments like these. She had developed an emotional shield to protect herself from the cruelty of men like Richard. But seeing her daughter humiliated this way was different. It was a pain that cut deeper than any personal insult. Lily watched the entire scene with an expression that was gradually changing. The initial confusion was being replaced by something more powerful: indignation. Not for herself, but for her mother, who worked 16 hours a day to support her 3 children, who never complained, who always found a way to put food on the table and school supplies in their backpacks. But enough games. Richard returned to his desk, clearly enjoying every second of his cruelty show. "Clara, can you start cleaning? And Lily, sit there quietly while the important adults work." "Excuse monsieur." Lily's clear, firm voice cut the air like a sharp knife. Richard turned, surprised that the child dared to interrupt. His expression was a mixture of amusement and irritation. "What do you want, girl? Are you here to defend your mommy?" Lily walked slowly toward the desk, her steps echoing on the marble with a determination that surprised everyone in the room. When she stood before Richard, for the first time in her short life, she looked directly into the eyes of an adult who was trying to intimidate her. "Sir," she said with a calm that contrasted dramatically with her age, "you said the best translators in the city can't read that document." Richard blinked, confused by the confidence in this child's voice, who should be trembling with fear. "That's right. So what? And can you read it?" The question hit Richard like an unexpected slap. All his life he had used his wealth and position to intimidate others, but he had never claimed to have specific academic knowledge. His fortune came from shrewd investments and ruthless business decisions, not higher education. That's not the point," Richard stammered, feeling for the first time in years that he was losing control of a conversation. "I'm not a translator." "Then you can't read it either," Lily declared, with simple but devastating logic. "That makes you less intelligent than the doctors, who also can't." Clara gasped. In 12 years of life, she had never seen her daughter challenge an adult this way. And she certainly had never seen anyone, child or adult, put Richard Sterling in such an uncomfortable position with a simple question. Richard felt his face flush, a mixture of anger and something he hadn't experienced in decades: shame. This 1-2-year-old girl had just exposed the fundamental hypocrisy in his logic with the brutal clarity of innocence. "That's completely different," he roared, his voice increasing in volume to compensate for the weakness of his argument. "I am a successful businessman. I'm worth $1 billion. But does that make you smarter?" Lily asked with the same unshakable calm. "My teacher says intelligence isn't measured by the money you have, but by what you know and how you treat others." The silence that followed was so deep that the hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Richard found himself completely disarmed by the simple yet impeccable logic of a 1-2-year-old girl who had just destroyed his central argument with the precision of a surgeon. Clara looked at her daughter with a mixture of terror and pride. Terror because she knew Richard Sterling had the power to destroy their lives with a single phone call. Pride because for the first time she was seeing her daughter stand up for herself and, by extension, defend her family's dignity. Furthermore, Lily continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You said I couldn't read the document because I'm the daughter of a cleaning woman, but you never asked me what languages I speak." Richard felt a strange chill run down his spine. There was something about the way Lily had uttered those last words that gave him a bad feeling. "What languages do you speak?" he asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to hear the answer. Lily looked him directly in the eyes with a confidence that seemed impossible in someone so young. "I speak native Spanish, advanced English, basic Mandarin, conversational Arabic, intermediate French, fluent Portuguese, basic Italian, conversational German, and basic Russian." The list flowed from her lips like a powerful litany, each language pronounced with a precision that made Richard's jaw slowly drop. Those are 9 languages, Lily added with a small but triumphant smile. How many do you speak, Mr. Sterling? The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Clara was paralyzed, not only by the shock of hearing her daughter list languages she didn't even know she knew, but by the realization that the power dynamic in the room had just completely shifted. Richard opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. For 51 years, he had used his wealth as a shield and a sword, intimidating others with his financial success. He had never found himself in a situation where a 1-2-year-old girl had outsmarted him intellectually in public. That's how, he stammered, all his arrogance evaporating like steam. Would you like me to try to read your document? Lily asked with a courtesy that somehow made the offer even more devastating. Perhaps I can help where the doctors could not. And at that moment, Richard Sterling realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had completely underestimated the wrong person and was about to discover that some humiliations cannot be bought your way out of. Little Lily Davis was about to change his world forever. The silence that followed Lily's question was so dense it seemed to have physical weight. Richard Sterling, the most powerful man in Canada, found himself completely paralyzed by a 1-2-year-old girl who had just shattered his logic with the brutal simplicity of truth. His hands trembled slightly as he processed what he had just heard. 9 languages. A child who supposedly should be grateful for the crumbs of public education had declared she spoke 9 languages more than he could learn in his entire life, even with all his millions. That's impossible, Richard finally stammered, his voice sounding strangely weak in the office he had designed specifically to intimidate. Where did you learn all that? Lily looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of patience and determination, as if explaining something obvious to an adult who hadn't been paying attention. At the Evergreen Public Library, Mr. Sterling. They have free language programs every day after school. There are also videos online, free apps, and books anyone can borrow if they're curious to learn. Each word was like a gentle but devastating slap. Richard realized that while he had been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on art no one saw, on exclusive restaurants where he boasted of his wealth, and on watches that cost more than Clara's annual salary, this child had been quietly building knowledge he could never buy. Clara looked at her daughter with a mixture of awe and terror. She had known Lily was intelligent, that she always brought home good grades, that she spent hours at the library, but she had never imagined the true extent of what her daughter had been silently learning. The programs are led by immigrants who live in the city. Lily continued with the same unshakable calm. Miss Wang teaches me Mandarin on Tuesdays. Ahmed helps me with Arabic on Thursdays. Maria practices Italian with me on Saturdays. They are people who, like my mom, have humble jobs, but know incredible things. Richard felt nauseous. This child had just described a learning network he had never known existed, a community of people he had automatically dismissed as inferior, but who apparently possessed knowledge rivaling that of university professors. But that doesn't mean you can read a complex academic document, Richard said, desperately clinging to any fragment of superiority he could maintain. Speaking basic languages isn't the same as understanding ancient, specialized texts. You're right, Lily nodded, surprising him. That's why I also study in the classical languages section of the university library on weekends. The librarians let me in because I always return books on time and never make noise. Richard's jaw dropped completely. The university library, Saturday mornings it's almost empty. I've been reading about comparative linguistics, ancient writing systems, and language evolution for the past 2 years. It's fascinating how languages connect across history. Richard sank into his chair as if someone had removed all the bones from his body. This 1-2-year-old girl had not only been learning modern languages, but had been independently studying subjects that normally required postgraduate degrees to fully comprehend. 2 years, his voice was barely audible. I started when I was 10. My mom worked double shifts to pay for private school for my older brother, but then she lost that extra job. When I went back to public school, I had a lot of free time because the classes were easier. So, I decided to use that time to learn things that really interested me. Each word was like a hammer blow directly to Richard's ego. He realized that while he had been boasting about the higher education his money could buy, this child had been gaining an education that was infinitely more impressive through pure intellectual curiosity and determination. "Show me," Richard said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "If you really know all that, show me." Lily looked at her mother, who nodded nervously and approached the desk where the mysterious document lay, which had defeated the city's 5 most prestigious translators. She took the papers with steady hands and studied them for a moment that felt like an eternity. Richard could see her eyes moving over the strange characters, recognizing patterns, making connections that the university experts had missed. "It's interesting," Lily murmured, more to herself than to the others. "It's not a single language. It's a combination of several writing systems, organized in thematic layers." Richard felt as if the whole world was turning upside down. What? What does that mean? The document is structured like a linguistic puzzle. Each paragraph is written in a different language, but all paragraphs speak of the same theme from different cultural perspectives. It's as if someone wanted to preserve the same wisdom across multiple linguistic traditions. Clara slowly approached, fascinated despite her terror. She had never seen her daughter speak with such academic authority. She had never witnessed the true extent of her intelligence. Can you read it?" Clara asked in a whisper. Lily looked up from the document and directly at Richard. "Would you like me to try, Mr. Sterling?" Richard felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice. Part of him wanted to say no. He wanted to maintain the illusion that this child was just that, a child who had gotten lucky with some memorized phrases. But another part of him, a part that had been buried under decades of arrogance, was genuinely curious to know what this extraordinary creature would say. "Yes," he mumbled. "Try." Lily returned her attention to the document and began to read, but what came out of her mouth completely paralyzed Richard. Because Lily Davis, the 1-2-year-old daughter of a cleaning lady, began to read the first paragraph in perfect classical Mandarin. Her pronunciation was impeccable, with tones that indicated not only knowledge of the language but a deep understanding of its cultural nuances. The words flowed from her lips like ancient music, laden with meaning and authority that seemed impossible in someone so young. Richard's mouth hung open, his expression of mockery transforming into one of absolute shock that he would never forget. For 51 years he had operated under the belief that real education, true intelligence, was only available to those who could afford it. This child had just shattered that belief completely, but Lily did not stop there. When she finished the first paragraph in Mandarin, without even pausing, she moved to the second paragraph and began to read in classical Arabic with the same supernatural fluency. The words came out of her mouth with a musicality that made Richard feel as if he was witnessing something impossible. This was not a child reciting memorized phrases. This was a genuine scholar who understood not only the words, but the cultural and historical contexts behind each expression. Clara brought her hands to her heart, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her daughter, her little Lily, who helped wash dishes after dinner and did her homework at the kitchen table under a flickering light bulb, was demonstrating a level of knowledge that rivaled that of university professors. Lily continued with the third paragraph, this time speaking in what sounded like ancient Sanskrit. Richard had no idea what she was saying, but he could hear the reverence in her voice, as if she understood not only the words but the spiritual and philosophical weight they carried. With each language Lily mastered perfectly, Richard's humiliation grew exponentially. He realized that for decades he had been boasting about his superior education in front of employees like Clara, when in reality, Clara's daughter knew more about practically any academic subject than he ever would. His world of certainty was crumbling, word by word, language by language. Lily read the fourth paragraph in what sounded like ancient Hebrew, her voice taking on a different quality that indicated deep respect for the tradition she was representing. Then the fifth paragraph in classical Persian, followed by the sixth in medieval Latin. When she finally finished reading, Lily looked up from the document and directly at Richard. For the first time in the history of his interactions with service employees, there was no submission in the eyes that looked at him. There was something he had never seen directed towards him. A deep, ancient, wise intelligence that had been hidden all this time behind economic poverty and youth. "Would you like me to translate the full meaning, Mr. Sterling?" Lily asked, with a calm that contrasted dramatically with the trembling that had invaded everyone present. Richard tried to speak, but only a choked sound came from his throat. His face had gone from red with anger to white with absolute shock. His hands trembled, and he could feel cold sweat running down his back despite the office air conditioning. Clara approached her daughter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Lily, how? Where did you learn all this?" Lily smiled for the first time since this whole situation had begun, but it was a smile that held a wisdom that seemed impossible in someone her age. "Mom," she replied with a voice that suddenly held a dignity Richard had never heard before in his office. "You always told me that education was the only thing no one could take away from me. So I decided to get all the education I could find, no matter if it was free or if I had to get it from public libraries." Those words were like a dagger directly to Richard's heart. He realized that this child had achieved more with free resources and personal determination than he had achieved with millions of dollars and elite connections. Richard finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled and weak. "What? What does the document say?" Lily placed the document on the marble desk with reverential care, as if it were a precious treasure. Her movements were suddenly different. She no longer had the hunched posture of a child trying to be invisible, but the upright posture of someone who knew her own intellectual worth. "The document speaks about the true nature of wisdom and wealth," Lily began, her voice clear and firm. "It says that true wisdom does not dwell in golden palaces, but in humble hearts. That real wealth is not counted in coins, but in the ability to see dignity in every soul." Each word was like an arrow aimed directly at Richard's soul. He realized that the document was not just a linguistic puzzle. It was a mirror reflecting exactly what he had become and what he had lost in the process. "It says that he who believes himself superior because of his possessions is the poorest of all men, for he has lost the ability to recognize the light in others," Lily continued, looking directly at Richard as she spoke. "And what else?" Richard whispered, though a part of him no longer wanted to hear the answer. "That true power does not come from the ability to humiliate others, but from the ability to elevate them. And that when a powerful man discovers he has been blind to the wisdom that surrounded him, that is the moment of his true awakening, or his eternal condemnation." The room fell into absolute silence when Lily finished. Richard realized that he had not only been humiliated by a 1-2-year-old girl, he had been judged by her and found wanting in all the aspects that truly mattered. He had come face to face with his own soul, and he didn't like anything he saw. The silence that followed Lily's words was so profound that Richard could hear his own heartbeat resonating like war drums in his ears. For the first time in 51 years of life, he found himself completely speechless, defenseless, without the armor of arrogance he had meticulously built for decades. His hands trembled as he clung to the edge of his marble desk, trying to find something solid in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. The child who had been standing in front of him was no longer simply the daughter of a cleaning lady. She was a brutal mirror reflecting everything he had lost, everything he had never been, and everything he could never buy with his $1.2 billion. Who are you, really?" Richard whispered, his voice barely audible in the office he had designed to intimidate, but which now felt like a prison of his own making. Lily looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of compassion and a wisdom that seemed impossible in someone 12 years old. "I am exactly who you have seen, Mr. Sterling. I am Lily Davis, daughter of Clara Davis, a student at Northwood Community School, and someone who believes everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." Each word was like a drop of acid falling on Richard's soul. He realized that all his life, he had been confusing external labels with people's real worth. He had judged Clara by her cleaning uniform, without ever asking himself what kind of mother could raise such an extraordinary daughter. He had assumed that economic poverty equaled intellectual poverty when the evidence to the contrary had been in front of him for years. Clara approached her daughter and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Lily, it's time to go," she murmured softly, clearly worried about the possible consequences of what had just happened. "No," Richard said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Please don't leave." Mother and daughter looked at him in surprise. For 8 years, Richard had never asked Clara for anything, please. He had never shown the slightest consideration for her schedule, her needs, or her basic humanity. I need to understand," Richard continued, struggling with words he had never uttered before. "How is this possible? How can a 1-2-year-old girl know more than me about everything?" Lily exchanged a glance with her mother, who nodded almost imperceptibly and approached the chair in front of Richard's desk. For the first time in that office's history, someone who wasn't a millionaire sat as an equal opposite the empire's owner. "I don't know more than you about everything, Mr. Sterling," Lily replied with brutal honesty. "You know about business, about making money, about managing companies. Those are skills I don't have." "But," she continued, and Richard could feel a devastating but coming, "you never learned about the things that really matter. You never learned about respect, about humility, about seeing the humanity in others. And those are the most important lessons of all." Richard felt as if each word was a direct punch to the stomach. "And you have learned them?" "My mom taught me," Lily replied simply, looking toward Clara with genuine love. "She works 16 hours a day to give my brothers and me a decent life. She never complains. She never speaks ill of the people who treat her unfairly. She always finds time to help me with my homework, even when she's exhausted." Clara felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard her daughter describe her sacrifices with such clarity and appreciation. "Do you know what my mom taught me that is more valuable than all your millions?" Lily asked, looking directly at Richard. "She taught me that true wealth is in the ability to make others feel valuable. She taught me that intelligence without kindness is simply educated cruelty. And she taught me that no matter how little you have materially, you can always choose to treat others with dignity." Each lesson was like a gentle but devastating slap. Richard realized that Clara, whom he had treated as if she were invisible for 8 years, had been raising a philosopher in her humble home, while he had been accumulating expensive objects in his empty mansion. "But I have worked my whole life to get where I am," Richard protested weakly, clinging to the last shreds of his self-image. "I've built an empire from scratch, and that's admirable." "It is," Lily agreed, surprising him with her firmness. "But the question is, why did you build it? To help others? To make the world a better place? Or just to feel superior to people like my mom?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but he realized he had no answer that wouldn't make him look like the selfish monster he probably was. "I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice cracking with the most honest admission he had made in decades. "That's the difference between us, Mr. Sterling," Lily said softly. "You never asked yourself why you were building your empire. I always ask myself why I am learning each new language, reading each new book, studying each new subject. And what's your answer? Because I want to understand the world well enough to help change it. Because I believe that education is a tool for justice, not for arrogance. And because I want to honor the sacrifices my mom has made by giving purpose to everything I've learned." Richard felt something strange stirring in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. It was a mixture of deep shame and something that could be admiration. Respect, he wasn't sure. But he knew it was the first time in decades he felt he was in the presence of someone genuinely superior to him. Not in money or power, but in the things that truly mattered. "What do I do now?" he asked, surprised by the genuine vulnerability in his own voice. Lily studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating whether the question was sincere or simply another manipulation. Apparently, she decided it was genuine. "First," she said, "you need to apologize to my mom, not just for today, but for 8 years of treating her as if she were invisible." Richard looked toward Clara, who had been watching the entire conversation with a mixture of terror and fascination. For 8 years, she had simply been the cleaning woman to him. He had never known her full name, never asked about her family, never even acknowledged her basic humanity. "Clara," he began, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all these years of treating you as if you weren't a real person. I'm sorry for never asking about your life, for never recognizing that you have a family, dreams, hopes, and I'm especially sorry for humiliating you in front of your daughter today." Clara gasped. In 8 years of work, Richard had never uttered her name, much less apologized for anything. But an apology isn't enough. Lily continued relentlessly. "Words are easy. Real change requires actions." "What kind of actions?" "You need to change how you treat all your employees. You need to learn their names, understand their lives, recognize their humanity. You need to use your wealth to elevate others instead of humiliating them." "But I don't know how to do that," Richard admitted, feeling like a lost child. "Then learn." Lily replied with the same determination she had used to learn 9 languages. "My mom can teach you. She knows more about real leadership than all the business books you've read." Richard looked toward Clara with new eyes. For the first time in 8 years, he truly saw her. He saw a woman who had raised an extraordinary daughter while working exhausting jobs. He saw someone who had maintained her dignity despite years of humiliation. He saw a real leader who had been under his nose all this time. "Clara," he said softly, "would you help me? Would you teach me how to be better?" Clara looked at him for a long moment, evaluating whether this transformation was genuine or temporary. Finally, she nodded slowly. "But there are conditions," Lily intervened. "Whatever you want," Richard replied immediately. "First, my mom needs a real job with a decent salary and respect. No more cleaning bathrooms for a man who can afford 100 employees." "Agreed." "Second, you are going to create a scholarship program for children like me, intelligent children from working-class families who deserve real opportunities." "Agreed." "Third, you are going to learn at least 1 new language to understand what it feels like to be in a student's shoes again." Richard blinked, surprised by that condition. "What language?" Lily smiled for the first time since this whole situation had begun. "I'm going to teach you Mandarin on Tuesdays after work at the Evergreen Public Library." The idea of Richard Sterling, the richest man in Canada, learning languages in a public library, was so revolutionary that it almost seemed impossible. But as he looked at this extraordinary child and her resilient mother, he realized that perhaps it was exactly the kind of impossible he needed in his life. "Do we have a deal?" Lily asked, extending her small but firm hand. Richard looked at the girl's hand for a moment, knowing that shaking it would fundamentally change who he was as a person. Then, for the first time in decades, he made a decision based not on money or power, but on the hope of becoming someone worthy of respect. He shook Lily's hand firmly. "We have a deal," he said, and for the first time in years he felt he had done something truly important. The change had begun 3 days after the encounter that had changed everything. Richard Sterling found himself doing something he had never imagined in his entire life, nervously waiting in the lobby of the Evergreen Public Library, a building he had driven past for decades without even noticing. His hands sweated as he held a basic university notebook he had bought at a neighborhood stationery store, feeling like a first-day student waiting to meet his most intimidating professor. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. For 51 years, Richard had operated from glass towers, marble offices, and boardrooms where every object cost more than the average family's annual salary. Now he was standing in a public space, surrounded by children doing homework, seniors reading newspapers, and mothers carrying babies while browsing for books. It was a completely different world from his own, a world that existed parallel to his bubble of privilege, without him ever having perceived it. "Mr. Sterling," a familiar voice pulled him from his anxious reflections. He turned to see Lily walking toward him with a school backpack laden with books and a smile that was professional yet warm. She was no longer wearing the worn school uniform she had worn during their first encounter, but casual weekend clothes that, though clearly not expensive, were immaculate and carefully matched. "Lily," Richard replied, surprised by how natural it sounded to pronounce her name with genuine respect. "Thank you for doing this. Are you ready for your first lesson?" Lily asked, gesturing toward the study tables that were full of students of all ages. "Honestly, I'm terrified," Richard admitted, a confession that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. "I haven't been a student since university, and that was 30 years ago." Lily guided him to a table in the language section, an area Richard had never known existed. The walls were covered with posters of alphabets in different languages, world maps marking linguistic families, and schedules of free classes in dozens of different languages. "All this is free?" Richard asked, with genuine incredulity. "Completely free," Lily replied as she organized basic Mandarin materials on the table. "The city believes that education should be accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford it." The statement hit Richard like a soft slap. For decades, he had assumed that quality education was a privilege that was bought, when apparently it had been available a few blocks from his office all this time. "We're going to start with the basics," Lily announced, opening a worn but well-cared-for textbook. "The 4 tones of Mandarin are fundamental. Without them, a word can mean completely different things." For the next hour, Richard experienced something he hadn't felt in decades, the absolute humility of being completely ignorant in a subject. Lily was a patient but demanding teacher, correcting his pronunciation with the same academic authority she had demonstrated when translating the mystical document. "Ma, ma, ma." Richard tried to repeat the tones, his voice sounding clumsy and rough compared to Lily's musical fluidity. "Better," Lily encouraged him after his 10th attempt. "Remember, the first tone is high and flat, as if you were singing a sustained note." Richard realized he was sweating from the mental effort of something this 1-2-year-old girl mastered with apparent ease. It was a deeper lesson in humility than any financial loss he had experienced. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said during a break. "Of course. How do you do this? How can you teach with such patience someone who treated you so badly?" Lily considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I believe in second chances, and because teaching is a way to honor all the teachers who have been patient with me." "But aren't you angry? Don't you feel resentment?" "I was angry," Lily admitted honestly, "very angry. But my mom taught me that anger is like holding a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. In the end, you only burn yourself." The wisdom of those words, coming from someone who could be his granddaughter, struck Richard deeply. He realized that he had been holding hot coals of arrogance and contempt for decades, burning himself without realizing it. "Let's continue," he said, determined to honor his young teacher's patience with genuine effort. As he clumsily progressed through basic Mandarin characters, Richard became consciously aware of his surroundings. At the next table, an older woman helped a child with math. At another, a group of teenagers studied in silence for exams. In the computer section, adults learned basic digital skills. It was a microcosm of learning and growth that had existed parallel to his world of luxury, without him ever perceiving it. He realized that he had been living in a bubble so dense that he had completely lost sight of the humanity around him. "Lily," he said softly, "can I meet some of your other teachers?" Lily's eyes lit up. "Seriously? You'd like to?" "I'd love to." Lily guided him through the library, introducing him to an extraordinary community of volunteer educators who had been operating under his nose for years. He met Ahmed, a Syrian refugee who taught Arabic while working as a taxi driver. Miss Wang, a retiree who had been a professor in Beijing before immigrating to reunite with her family. Maria, a domestic worker who taught Italian on weekends. Each introduction was like a soft punch to his previous worldview. These people, whom he would have automatically dismissed as service workers, turned out to be brilliant educators with extraordinary stories of resilience and knowledge. "Dr. Ahmed," Richard said, using the title Lily had told him was appropriate. "Lily tells me you teach classical Arabic." Ahmed smiled warmly. "It is an honor to keep the language alive. In my country, I was a university professor of literature. Here I drive a taxi. But languages live in the heart." Richard felt a pang of shame as he remembered how many times he had taken taxis driven by men like Ahmed, without ever wondering about their previous lives, their losses, their silent contributions to the community. Could you teach me some Arabic too?" he asked timidly. "It would be an honor," Ahmed replied, and Richard could see tears forming in his eyes. "It's been a long time since someone asked me to teach for the simple love of knowledge." When he finally finished his first Mandarin lesson, Richard felt physically and mentally exhausted, but also strangely energized. For decades he had assumed he was done learning, that his education was complete. Discovering that he could still struggle with new concepts, still feel the satisfaction of mastering something difficult, was an unexpected revelation. "Same time next week?" Lily asked as she packed her materials. "Absolutely," Richard replied without hesitation. "And Lily, thank you. Not just for the language lesson, but for showing me a world I had been ignoring." "You weren't ignoring it," Lily corrected gently. "You just didn't know it existed. Now that you know, you can choose what to do with that knowledge." As Richard drove back to his mansion that night, his thoughts were completely occupied by the day's lessons. Not just the Mandarin lessons, but the deeper lessons about community, humility, and the wealth of knowledge that existed in places he had never thought to look. The next day, Richard did something that surprised his entire executive team. He called an emergency meeting, not to discuss profits or expansion, but to talk about corporate social responsibility. "I want us to establish a full scholarship program for students from working-class families," he announced to his surprised executives. "And I want us to sponsor language programs in public libraries across the city." "What's the return on investment?" his CFO asked, with evident confusion. "The return is that we live in a better society," Richard replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "The return is that we stop wasting human talent due to accident of birth." His executives exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking their boss had lost his mind. But Richard no longer cared what the men who had been complicit in his previous arrogance thought. That same week, he fulfilled another of his promises. Clara Davis was officially hired as Director of People Development, with a salary that was 10 times what she had been earning as a cleaning employee. Her first task would be to work with Richard to identify and develop hidden talent among all the company's employees. "Clara," Richard told her during their first official meeting, "I want you to teach me everything Lily says you know about real leadership." Clara, still adjusting to her new office and status, looked at him with a mixture of determination and nervousness. "Mr. Sterling, real leadership isn't about power over others. It's about power to elevate others. Teach me," Richard said simply. And so began an education worth more than all the university degrees and business master's degrees that money could buy. An education about humanity, humility, and the responsibility that comes with real privilege. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling was learning the lessons that truly mattered. 6 weeks after the encounter that had changed everything, Richard Sterling found himself facing something he hadn't anticipated, a silent but determined rebellion from his closest social circle. The exclusive Pinnacle Club, where he had lunched every Friday for the past 15 years, had suddenly become hostile territory. "Richard, we need to talk," declared Alistair Macmillan, an oil magnate and one of his oldest golf partners, as he sat heavily across from him in the club's private dining room. His eyes held the hardness of someone who had come to stage an intervention. "Of course, Alistair. What do you want to talk about?" Richard replied, though he could perfectly sense where the conversation was headed. "About your recent erratic behavior," Alistair began, gesturing with his $1,000 bottle of wine. "The whole city is talking. They say you're learning languages in public libraries, that you promoted a cleaning lady to an executive position, that you're spending millions on scholarships for poor children." "All that is true," Richard confirmed calmly, continuing with his lunch as if they were discussing the weather. "Are you crazy?" Spencer Caldwell, heir to a pharmaceutical empire, intervened, his voice full of disbelief. "A cleaning lady as an executive? You? Learning in public libraries? With common people?" Richard felt a familiar pang of irritation, but this time it wasn't directed at those who challenged him, but at his own past attitudes reflected in his old friends. "Clara Davis is smarter and has better leadership skills than most executives I've met," Richard replied calmly. "And yes, I am learning Mandarin and Arabic with extraordinary teachers who happen to work as taxi drivers and domestic staff." "Extraordinary teachers who work as taxi drivers?" Alistair laughed cruelly. "Richard, you're completely losing perspective. Those people aren't real teachers. They're failures who couldn't keep jobs in their own countries." The statement hit Richard like a slap. It was exactly the kind of comment he himself would have made 6 weeks earlier, and now it struck him as not only ignorant, but cruelly inhumane. "Alistair, Doctor. Ahmed held a chair in Arabic literature at Damascus University before the war destroyed his country," Richard responded, his voice acquiring an edge his friends had rarely heard. "Miss Wang was head of the linguistics department in Beijing before immigrating to reunite with her family. They are not failures. They are brilliant refugees and immigrants who are rebuilding their lives." "And since when do you care about that?" Spencer asked with evident disdain. "For years you've scoffed at those very people. What changed?" Richard considered the question carefully. What had really changed? Was it just the shock of being humiliated by Lily, or had it been something deeper? "I realized I had been living in a bubble so dense that I had completely lost sight of what it means to be human," Richard replied honestly. "I realized I had mistaken financial success for moral superiority, and that I had been wasting opportunities to meet extraordinary people because of stupid prejudices." "This is ridiculous," interrupted Franklin Dubois, a telecom tycoon who had arrived late to the conversation but had heard enough to catch up. "Richard, we all know you're going through some kind of crisis. Maybe you should consider taking a vacation, seeing a psychiatrist." "I'm not having a crisis," Richard interrupted firmly. "For the first time in decades, I am completely sane. You are the ones living in a fantasy where money makes you better people." The silence that followed was tense and hostile. Richard could see that he had crossed a line with his old friends, who had come expecting him to admit his mistake and return to the fold of shared arrogance. "Look, Richard," Alistair leaned forward, his voice becoming menacing. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it's affecting all of us. The other businessmen are starting to question our circle. They're wondering if we've all gone soft." "And that worries you?" Richard asked with genuine curiosity. "Of course it worries me. Our power comes from sticking together, from presenting a unified front. When one of us starts acting like a social activist, it weakens everyone." Richard realized something fundamental at that moment. His old friends weren't worried about his mental well-being or his business success. They were worried because his transformation threatened the system of privilege from which they all benefited. "Do you know what I've learned in these 6 weeks?" Richard asked, standing up slowly. "I've learned that true power doesn't come from the ability to exclude others, but from the ability to elevate them." "That's progressive nonsense," Spencer spat. "Real power comes from competition, from superiority, from keeping the competition down." "And how's that working out for you?" Richard asked. "Are you happy? Do you feel fulfilled? Can you look yourselves in the mirror and feel proud of who you are as people?" The questions hung in the air like bombs waiting to explode. Richard could see in his old friends' faces that he had touched something uncomfortable, something they preferred not to examine. "Happiness is a luxury," Franklin responded defensively. "We focus on real success." "And what is real success?" Richard pressed. "Numbers in a bank account? The ability to humiliate employees? Living in a bubble where you never have to confront your own humanity? You're talking like an idiot." Alistair stood up abruptly, clearly frustrated. "Richard, we're giving you a week to reconsider this phase. After that, you'll have to choose between keeping your place in this circle or continuing with this social justice ridiculousness." "I don't need a week," Richard replied immediately. "I choose to continue being a decent person. If that means losing your approval, then so be it." The silence that followed was absolute. For 15 years, these men had been his most intimate social circle, his validators, his accomplices in mutual arrogance. Losing their approval would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. "Fine," Alistair said finally, picking up his jacket. "But when this experiment in kindness fails, when you realize that the real world doesn't work with hugs and language lessons, don't come to us asking to be taken back." "I won't," Richard promised. "Because I've discovered something you apparently have never experienced. I've found a social circle based on mutual respect, personal growth, and genuine contribution to the well-being of others. And it turns out it's infinitely more satisfying than this." As his old friends left the dining room with expressions of disgust, Richard felt strangely relieved. For years, he had maintained these friendships out of habit and social convenience, without realizing how toxic they had been to his development as a person. That same afternoon, Richard kept his weekly appointment at the Evergreen Public Library. As he practiced Chinese characters with Lily, he told her about his confrontation with his old friends. "Do you feel bad about losing those friendships?" Lily asked with genuine curiosity. "Surprisingly, no," Richard admitted. "I feel like I've dropped a weight I had been carrying for years without realizing it." "It's normal," commented Ahmed, who had joined their study session. "When you start to grow as a person, sometimes you have to leave behind relationships that no longer serve you." "But don't you feel lonely sometimes?" Richard asked. "At first, yes, miss." Wang intervened from the next table. "But then you discover that there's an entire world of authentic people waiting to meet you. You just couldn't see them before, because you were surrounded by mirrors that reflected your worst version." The words resonated deeply with Richard. He realized that he had been surrounded by people who reflected and validated his worst qualities, while now, he was surrounded by people who inspired him to be better. "Besides," Lily added with a smile, "now you have real friends. Friends who appreciate you for who you are trying to be, not for how much money you have." Richard looked around the study table, at Lily with her impossible wisdom, at Ahmed with his unwavering dignity, at Miss Wang with her infinite patience, and he realized they were right. He had gained something much more valuable than what he had lost. "You're right," he said finally. "And you know what the best part is?" "What?" they asked in unison. "For the first time in decades, when I look in the mirror, I like the person I see looking back." It was the simplest and most profound truth he had uttered in his entire life. 3 months after the encounter that had changed everything, Richard Sterling found himself standing in front of his office mirror, adjusting his tie for the most important event of his new life. But it wasn't a meeting with billionaire investors or the signing of a contract that would multiply his profits. It was something much more significant. The graduation ceremony of the first class of the Lily Davis Scholarship Program, which he had established in honor of the girl who had taught him the true meaning of intelligence. The physical change in Richard was notable. He had lost weight, not from stress as in previous years, but because he had started walking daily through city neighborhoods he had never visited, meeting beneficiary families of his programs, listening to their stories. His face no longer had the perpetually tense expression of the man who lived in constant competition with the world. Now there was a serenity in his eyes that spoke of someone who had finally found real purpose in his life. "Mr. Sterling," Clara's voice pulled him from his reflections. It was no longer the trembling voice of a cleaning employee, but the professional and confident voice of the most successful director of people development his company had ever had. "The graduates have arrived." Clara Davis had transformed as much as Richard during these months. She no longer wore the navy blue cleaning uniform, but elegant professional suits that reflected her new position. But more than her external appearance, what had changed was her posture. She no longer walked with her head bowed, expecting to be invisible, but with the confidence of someone who knows her ideas are valued and respected. "How are the final program numbers?" Richard asked, as they walked toward the auditorium. "Extraordinary," Clara replied, opening a folder that contained data that would have been impossible to imagine 3 months earlier. 150 students from working-class families received full scholarships to prestigious universities. 98% maintained averages above 4. And most importantly, 32 of them have already decided to give back to the program as volunteer mentors. Richard felt a warmth spreading through his chest. For decades, he had measured success solely in terms of financial gains. Now he discovered that there were much more satisfying metrics. Lives changed, opportunities created, cycles of educational poverty broken. "And the language program in the libraries?" he asked. "It has expanded to 12 libraries across the city. We have over 500 regular students learning 15 different languages. The volunteer teachers have grown to 73, including refugees, immigrants, and retirees who had never had the opportunity to share their knowledge." When they arrived at the auditorium, Richard gasped. The space was filled not only with the graduating students and their families, but with an entire community that had grown around the programs he had established. He recognized familiar faces from the Evergreen Public Library, volunteer teachers who had become his friends, and employees of his company whose lives had been transformed by the new human development policies. Mr. Sterling, a familiar voice greeted him from the front row. It was Lily, but a different Lily, from the 2-year-old girl he had met 3 months earlier, now 13. She had grown not only physically but in confidence and presence. She wore an elegant dress, not expensive but carefully chosen, and her eyes shone with the pride of someone who had seen her ideas become reality. "Lily," Richard said, surprised by the genuine emotion in his own voice. "How do you feel seeing all this?" "Like I'm living a dream," Lily replied, gesturing toward the packed auditorium. 3 months ago, I was just a girl studying in the library. Now there are hundreds of kids like me who have real opportunities." "You weren't just a girl," Richard corrected gently. "You were a teacher disguised as a student, and you were the best teacher I've ever had." As Richard circulated through the auditorium before the ceremony, he heard stories that filled him with a satisfaction he had never experienced in all his successful financial transactions. Maria Rodriguez, daughter of a domestic worker, had received a full scholarship to study engineering at a national university. Charles, whose father worked as a mechanic, was going to study medicine at a top university. Anya Sharma, daughter of Venezuelan immigrants, had been accepted into a linguistics program at another prestigious university. Each story was a testament to the talent that had been wasted in the city due to lack of economic opportunity. Richard realized that for years he had been operating under the false belief that academic excellence was the exclusive privilege of wealthy families, when the reality was that intellectual brilliance was uniformly distributed among all social classes. "Dr. Ahmed," Richard greeted the Syrian refugee who now coordinated the language program in 3 city libraries. "How are things going?" "Better than I could have dreamed," Ahmed replied with tears in his eyes. "A year ago, I was a taxi driver with broken dreams. Today, I am the coordinator of a program that has taught languages to over 2,000 people. This is what a real second chance means. And you've given second chances to thousands of people, miss." Wang intervened, who had developed a Mandarin curriculum, now used in universities in 4 countries, including yourself. Richard realized the profound truth in those words. His transformation had essentially been a second chance to be the person he always had the potential to be, but who had been buried under decades of arrogance and emotional disconnection. Mr. Sterling, a young journalist from a major news outlet, approached with a camera. "Could we do a quick interview before the official conference?" "Of course," Richard agreed, though he no longer felt the desperate need for media attention that had characterized his previous personality. "A year ago, you were known as one of Canada's most successful, but also most controversial, businessmen. Today you are donating half your fortune to educational programs. What caused this radical change?" Richard considered the question carefully. Over the past few months, he had answered variations of this question dozens of times, but each time he found new layers of truth to explore. "A 13-year-old girl taught me that I had been measuring success with completely wrong metrics," Richard replied honestly. "She taught me that true wealth is not counted in what you accumulate, but in what you share. That true intelligence is not demonstrated by humiliating others, but by elevating them. And that true power does not come from the ability to control, but from the ability to serve. And aren't you afraid this will negatively affect your competitive position in the business world?" Richard laughed genuinely. "It turns out that when you treat people with dignity, when you invest in their growth, when you create an environment where talent can flourish regardless of its origin, your company becomes more successful, not less. We've had the most profitable year in the company's history, precisely because we stopped seeing employees as expenses and started seeing them as investments." The interview continued, but Richard was increasingly aware that the questions, though important, didn't truly capture the essence of what had happened. His transformation had not been a change in business strategy or a calculated public relations decision. It had been a fundamental awakening to his own humanity. Finally, the time came for the official conference. Richard walked to the podium, but before beginning, he did something that surprised everyone. He invited Lily to join him on stage. Lily Davis, now 13, had grown not only physically but in presence and moral authority. She wore an elegant navy blue dress, not expensive, but chosen with the same care that characterized everything she did. Her eyes held the same penetrating intelligence that had disarmed Richard a year earlier, but now they also had the confidence of someone who had seen her ideas transform into tangible reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice clear but laden with genuine emotion. "Exactly 1 year ago, I was in this very office convinced that I was the most successful man in Canada. I had $1 billion, the fear-based respect of my employees, and the envious admiration of my peers. I was also, unknowingly, one of the poorest and most miserable men in the country." The auditorium was in absolute silence, each word resonating with the authority of lived experience. Then, this extraordinary young woman walked into my office and gave me the most important lesson of my life. Lily Davis showed me that I had been confusing financial success with human superiority, that I had been wasting opportunities to meet extraordinary people because of stupid prejudices, and that I had been using my privilege to separate instead of connect, to humiliate instead of elevate. Richard looked toward Lily, who smiled at him encouragingly. But Lily not only humbled me, though I certainly deserved it, she offered me something much more valuable. She offered me the opportunity for redemption. She taught me that it's never too late to change, that it's never too late to be better, and that real transformation requires not only recognizing your mistakes, but taking concrete actions to amend them. During this year, I have had the privilege of learning from an extraordinary community of educators, students, working families, refugees, and immigrants who have shown me what it truly means to contribute to society. I have learned that education is the great equalizer, that talent is uniformly distributed, but opportunities are not, and that when you invest in human potential, the returns exceed any financial investment. Richard paused, allowing the words to resonate in the packed auditorium. Today I announce the creation of the Lily Davis Foundation for Human Dignity, endowed with $500 million, intended to expand inclusive educational programs throughout Canada and beyond. But more important than the money is the philosophy behind this foundation, the belief that every person, no matter where they were born or how much money their parents have, deserves the opportunity to fully develop their potential. The ovation that followed was immediate and sustained, but Richard raised his hand to continue. "However, I don't want this conference to be about me or my money. I want it to be about the people who have truly made this transformation possible. I want you to hear from Lily Davis, who at 13 years old understands more about leadership, human dignity, and social justice than most adults I know." Richard stepped away from the microphone and gestured toward Lily, who approached with the same quiet confidence she had demonstrated during their first encounter. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Lily began, her voice clear and firm, resonating throughout the auditorium. "A year ago, when I first walked into your office, I wasn't trying to change the world. I was just trying to defend my mom's dignity and show that a person's worth isn't determined by their job or their bank account. But what I've learned this year is that individual changes can create ripples that transform entire communities. When one person decides to see the humanity in others, when they decide to use their privilege to create opportunities instead of barriers, when they decide that real success is measured by how much they elevate others, that individual decision can change thousands of lives." Lily looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with students, parents, teachers. "The programs we are announcing today are not just about education, they are about dignity. They are about the fundamental belief that every child, every young person, every adult deserves the opportunity to reach their potential. They are about creating a society where your postcode doesn't determine your destiny, where your parents' job doesn't limit your dreams, where curiosity and effort are rewarded regardless of your background. But I also want to speak directly to the young people who are here today," Lily continued, her voice acquiring a special intensity. "Don't wait to be adults to start changing the world. Don't wait to have money to start making a difference. Transformation begins with deciding to see others as complete human beings, with inherent dignity. It begins with choosing kindness over cruelty, inclusion over exclusion, collaboration over destructive competition. And to the adults I say, it's never too late to learn, to grow, to be better." Mr. Sterling was 51 years old when he decided to fundamentally change who he was as a person. If he could do it, anyone can do it. Lily paused, allowing her words to resonate. "The future we are building together is one where education is a right, not a privilege, where talent is nurtured, not wasted, where diversity is celebrated, not feared, where success is measured by how much you contribute to the common good, not just your own. This foundation is just the beginning. It is the seed of a transformation that must extend far beyond Canada, far beyond North America. It is the promise that we can create a world where every child has the opportunity to achieve their dreams, where every family has real hope for the future, where every community can flourish. When Lily finished her presentation, the ovation was different from anything Richard had ever heard before. It wasn't just applause. It was the sound of collective hope, of the recognition that real change was possible, of the understanding that they were witnessing the birth of something transformative. As the journalists asked questions and university representatives discussed implementation, Richard found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple lesson in humility. He realized that his transformation had followed a pattern he could now clearly articulate. First had come the humiliation that destroyed his false self-image, then had come the education that showed him new possibilities. After that had come the action that transformed ideas into reality, and finally had come the multiplication, where his individual change had become a movement that touched thousands of lives. After the conference, as the crowd dispersed, Richard found himself alone with Lily and Clara in the transformed office. "How does it feel?" Clara asked, gesturing toward the windows that now showed a city where hundreds of young people had new opportunities thanks to the programs they had created. "I feel like I've finally found what my life was made for," Richard replied honestly. "Not to accumulate personal wealth, but to distribute opportunities. Not to demonstrate superiority, but to recognize and nurture the greatness in others." "And don't you miss your old life?" Lily asked with genuine curiosity. "The power, the fear-based respect, the simplicity of only caring about yourself?" Richard considered the question carefully. "Do you know what I miss about my old life?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because I realize now that that old life wasn't really living. It was simply existing in a bubble of privilege that separated me from everything that makes life worthwhile. Real human connections, transcendent purpose, the satisfaction of contributing to the well-being of others. Besides," he added with a smile, "it turns out that helping others is the most selfishly satisfying activity there is. Every time I see a student graduate, every time I see a family break cycles of educational poverty, every time I see a refugee find new hope, I experience a joy that no financial transaction had ever given me." Lily smiled. "My mom always says that real happiness doesn't come from getting what you want, but from wanting what you have and using what you have to help others." "Your mom is the wisest woman I've ever met," Richard responded, looking toward Clara with genuine respect. "And you are the youngest and most effective teacher I've had in my life." As the sun set over Toronto, the three stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on the extraordinary year they had shared and the years of impact that would come. "Do you know what's the most incredible thing about all this?" Richard finally broke the silence. "What?" Lily and Clara asked in unison. "That this is just the beginning. The $500 million of the foundation is going to directly touch the lives of at least 50,000 students in the next 5 years. But those students are going to touch the lives of others, who are going to touch the lives of others. The impact is going to multiply exponentially for decades. It's like throwing a stone into a lake. The ripples keep spreading long after the stone has disappeared," Lily observed. "Exactly. And the original stone was a 1-2-year-old girl who had the courage to confront a powerful man with the truth," Richard responded. "Lily, you not only changed my life, you changed the course of thousands of lives you don't even know yet." As they left the office that night, Richard knew he had found something all his previous money had never been able to buy. A legacy that would endure far beyond his own life. A contribution to the world that would be measured not in financial gains, but in opportunities created, in dreams realized, in cycles of injustice broken. The transformation was complete, but the impact was just beginning. And it had all started with a simple lesson about human dignity, taught by an extraordinary girl who had seen beyond appearances to recognize the potential for goodness that exists in every human heart.